You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
New Chicago Bears special teams coordinator Richard Hightower doesn't come in with the most sparkling resume of any candidate, but how much of that is the personnel he's had available to him before and in Chicago versus how much is the coach himself contributing? This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm an analyst for Pro Football Focus, and I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can join the Locked On Bears. You hit that subscribe button on the YouTube channel, our video podcast as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears today and hopefully every day. Today it is all special teams. We're going to get to know new special teams coordinator Richard Hightower a little bit more, what he's done in the past in his previous stops, including his time in Chicago and what he learned in Chicago, working certainly with Robbie Gould in San Francisco, not specifically at the same time in Chicago, but also worked with Pat O'Donnell in Chicago, got to know, kicking at Soldier Field and how that will sort of inform his experience now running the Chicago Bears special teams. And we'll look at sort of how that takes shape in 2022, what the Bears are going to do at punter and long snapper with both of them free agents, what the kick return games could look like with Jakeem Grant as a free agent and Tariq Cohen recovering from injury, but a little bit, I don't want to say MIA, but just more of a mystery on what exactly is going to happen on that back end. We'll go through for that all-important third phase in 2022. Hightower was kind of the hiring that slipped through the cracks a little bit or flew under the radar, in part because special teams coordinators don't get as much attention, but more so like what really mattered is, right, Bears offensive coordinator and offensive staff, first and foremost, under Matt Eberflus. We talked and heard from Luke Getsy 2 days ago on the Locked On Bears podcast. Yesterday, we did defensive coordinator Alan Williams and how he's going to have some real autonomy over this Eberflus defense and will be calling the plays there. So now, of course, we have to turn our attention to Richard Hightower, who comes over after, 5 seasons as the San Francisco 49ers special teams coordinator. And talking to Brian Peacock from Locked On 49ers, just, off the air on the side, I was surprised to learn that 49ers fans were, not disappointed to lose him, right? They kind of felt like, not the worst special teams in the NFL by any means, right? They're not the Green Bay Packers. There's not that level of any kind of disaster happening in San Francisco, but like average to below average and seemingly starting to get a little bit worse over the last few seasons with the 49ers. They were kind of ready, at least 49ers fans were kind of ready for something a little bit different maybe. And the big sort of theme that underlies this is like, okay, how much is actually Richard Hightower, the coach, versus some of the personnel that he had to work with. So, right, 49ers fans, no complaints about Robbie Gould as their kicker, right? Robbie Gould was his kicker every season in San Francisco, and I think there was one year where he dropped off a little bit, but right, we know how good Robbie Gould was, and continues to be for the 49ers. He could be in this salary cap casualty conversation this offseason, which could be interesting. But regardless, kicking the field goals was fine for the 49ers. Punts, a little bit more mediocre. The last 3 years have been Mitch Wishnowsky, their punter. And on the spectrum of punters, I'm not a punting expert, but I've done some special teams grading over the years for Pro Football Focus. Like he's a little bit on the lower end of like hang time, and hang time is really important for like giving your coverage team time to get to the return man, like, because he's not a super leg distance guy either. So like if you're going to kick it short, ideally you want to at least kick it high so he doesn't have time to actually return it afterwards, but he didn't really have the length or the height. Wishnowsky seemed to be a little bit more better directionally as far as like, coffin corner of sorts, but maybe that's a little bit of a, it's not a purely coffin corner, but, keeping things away from the kicker or putting it to the sides, making them harder to return that way. So I think we saw of leg strength hurt them on kickoff. They didn't really backs too many opportunities for opposing teams to return. And then each return opportunity is always that chance they can break something free. So there was some room for improvement there. But how much of that is just the punter's ability, right? Can the special teams coach make Wishnowsky a better punter all of a sudden? I mean, maybe he can improve a little bit here and there, but some of it's just the personnel that you have. Or like the return game for San Francisco has been really an issue for the last few seasons now. Because when for a while there with Hightower, they had wide receiver Richie James kind of be their punt and kick return guy, and then then they brought in Jerick McKinnon, the running back, to be their kickoff return guy, and James got hurt in 2020, so they were going with some James, but then Trent Taylor and River Craycraft, some different wide receivers rotating in there. And then I think Richie James was then on IR for all of 2021. So they had this carousel of kickoff returners to try and replace Jerick McKinnon. They had Brandon Ayuk, the young wide receiver, returning punts, and he was kind of below average. So really the last couple seasons, they haven't had consistency in the return game. And some of it I think has been maybe a lack of investment in personnel in terms of like a bona fide, dynamic kick returning type athlete, and partially Richie James being injured there. But, I'm sure the blocking could be better too. And so how much of that do you put on, Richard Hightower as the special teams coordinator, and how much is personnel, but how much influence does he have in special teams personnel, right? He is the special teams coach. He's not signing the wide receivers specifically for special teams, right? He's not signing players necessarily for those roles individually, but they didn't seem to prioritize it as much in San Francisco compared to like what we saw the Bears do with Cordell Patterson before, and now Jakeem Grant, now going to be a free agent. I have a minute to get into some of that stuff in a little while here. But like, coverage-wise, it did seem like the one thing I will give Rich Hightower credit for, if you kind of go through 49ers special teams each year, it seemed like their tackling did improve, right? It wasn't that they were ever terrible at, missing a bunch of special teams tackles all the time, but like year to year, the number of special teams tackles they missed did go down. It seemed like they were, as we talk about these ideas of like the hits principle and the hustle, the effort and tackling that is going to be a big philosophy thing for this Bears team, it does seem like Hightower fit into that pretty well in San Francisco. So it certainly wasn't like all bad and wasn't terrible either, just not a lot of like great special teams up until the Green Bay Packers game in the playoffs where they blocked the punt and really score, score on special teams and really flip that game with their special teams in the playoffs. So obviously coming off of the highest point for Hightower is a good time to make the jump over to Chicago, and a good thing he can point to us like, see, my teaching, our coaching works, our philosophies work, and you can also be successful and win games with special teams under Richard Hightower. So that sort of sets the stage for what he's bringing now in his return to Chicago, because yes, he was a member of this Bears coaching staff previously. We'll go into some specifics on what it was like then and what he says he learned from that opportunity here and kicking in Soldier Field in particular next on Locked On Bears. Well, there's no more football on our TVs each Sunday, but you can make all the remaining sports we still do have even more exciting with our friends at BetOnline. A little bit of action can make sports that you might not care about or teams that you might not care about as much that much more important when you have a little bit of money on the line. Because, of course, basketball is in full steam for both pro and college hoops. So for all the latest odds, totals, and player performance props, betonline.net is going to be the number one spot for all of your sports betting needs. Whether it's scores, podcasts, and news on not just basketball, but any sport, BetOnline is the best spot for hockey, soccer, tennis, boxing. If the Players Association and Major League Baseball can work out an agreement, do we have a baseball season? Betting on baseball can make those games a lot less boring when you're waiting for that key run to put you over the top, to hit that over the spread, or however you're going to bet. Our friends at betonline.net have everything you need for all your sports betting needs. Head on over to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action you need to know. Because at BetOnline, it's where the game starts. New Chicago Bears special teams coordinator Richard Hightower is going to start with some limited experience as far as coaching in Chicago, and specifically the winds of Soldier Field, right? That's such a challenge for most opponents that come into town. And so I imagine, a new special teams coordinator coming in, had he had no experience kicking in that Chicago wind, you could imagine there would be a learning curve there for, getting an understanding of how it swirls, in which end zone, where it swirls, and how it swirls. Excuse me. And I think 1 year in 2016 when he was here isn't necessarily a PhD in kicking in Soldier Field, but I think there is some real experience that he's going to bring in there. Plus, he worked with Robbie Gould for 5 years, I think it is, in San Francisco. So surely he could rely on Robbie Gould as a resource for some of that. But then also, like, the 49ers played at the Bears, I think twice. I think 2017 and 2021, this past season, would have both been under Hightower at Soldier Field when the Bears hosted the 49ers. So then, of course, he and Robbie would have talked about it then. Robbie, I assume Robbie has a PhD or whatever cliche you want to use in kicking at Soldier Field and understanding those wins. So I think between Hightower's 1 year of doing it here and 1 year, or I guess 2 games of doing it and 5 years with Robbie Gould, he has a pretty firm perspective, and I think it's not that there's always a magical formula to it, but as he said himself, I think having some of that experience and background will just make the transition easier and make it less of a learning curve as he takes over the full special teams coordinator spot.
I'm curious, how much do you know about kicker Cairo Santos and your time here as assistant? What did you learn about kicking at Soldier Field, not only field goals, but punting as well?
Yeah, that's another great question. I just know Cairo through tape, watching him, competing against him. Obviously, we played here last year, and then coaching here when I was there the first time. The wind swirls. It could be a downwind at times. It could change minute to minute, quarter to quarter. So you just have to really be on top of those situations, and it just changes. So that's the challenging part about it, and it's fun to punt and kick in that stadium in Soldier Field. So good question.
So, it has been, 6-7 years now since Hightower coached in Chicago. Not that the winds have changed, but just a lot has sort of changed in that time. And that was the 2016 season. That was the year they went 13-3 under John Fox. That would have been year 3 of John Fox. No, Fox took 15-6. So year 2 of John Fox. That was, the last year of Jay Cutler, where he got hurt and didn't really finish the season there. So they had Brian Hoyer start some games and Matt Barkley start some games at quarterback. Jordan Howard was a rookie running back and made the Pro Bowl, I think, that year. That was also the year Cam Meredith had his mini, 888-yard-ish breakout season at wide receiver. How things have changed since then. But it was Pat O'Donnell was still the Bears punter at that time. I think actually it was year 3 of Pat O'Donnell. We forget just how long Pat O'Donnell has been this Bears punter. So there's immediately that familiarity with Hightower. And again, a punter who knows the Soldier Field wins. We'll get into it in a minute that O'Donnell is a free agent and some of the dynamics at play there, but it also helps that, Cairo Santos is currently still here because, that year under Hightower, that year Hightower was here, Jeff Rogers was the special teams coordinator. Jay Rogers was the defensive line coach. Jeff Rogers was the special teams coach that year. And that was the year that the kicker was Connor Barth. The full-time kicker was Connor Barth. It wasn't the trying out Connor Barth and mixing in other kickers, but it was 16 games of Connor Barth. I think he hit 78-ish percent with some rounding in there, 78-ish percent of his field goals that season. Very, very, mediocre kicking and a new kicker to a new environment for him, right? He didn't have the experience to sort of build up some of that, maybe over the course of the season, but not right away. Return game, that was Eddie Royal as the punt returner. There's a name for you. And how about this name? Deontay Thompson as the kickoff returner. And they weren't anything particularly special, but Eddie Royal had a 64-yard punt return touchdown that season. Not very many teams can consistently score kickoff or punt return touchdowns nowadays. So that was something, a score there for Eddie Royal. And then Deontay Thompson had one long one that season. I think he went for 60-plus-ish, but didn't score. And I remember that year feeling with Thompson back there, not that Thompson was this dynamic player, because I think there was a couple muffs in there, but it did feel like there were a few times when he would get ahead of steam and maybe there would be one tackle to break, or it'd feel like there might be one tackle to break before he could break free down the sideline. And he never quite got there. But, he came close a couple of times, and at least the special teams were not disastrous. I mean, Barth was not good. O'Donnell was okay, but they were okay. And I guess that sort of fits what Hightower has done in San Francisco, right? Same kind of thing. They're not disastrous, but they were just kind of okay. But again, it raises this question. It's Connor Barth's not a good kicker. So of course he's only going to hit 78. He hasn't gone on to be a great kicker somewhere else. So do you how much do you put on the special teams coaching staff there? And Deontay Thompson's not a prolific kickoff returner, has not really, gone on to do that or had a history of doing that prior. Eddie Royal had a history of being a punt return guy earlier in his career in Denver and stuff, but he was on the wrong side of 30 and not quite as dynamic of an athlete and as a receiver as he was younger in his career. So again, I think the theme keeps coming back for me. It's like it's going to be all about what personnel they set up Hightower with, because I think special teams coordinating ends up being so much more like coaching about coverage teams and the other 10 guys that aren't the kicker and the return teams, the other 10 guys that are not the return men. We just don't really have consistent ways to measure like how good are the blockers on your kickoff return team in San Francisco. And you can look at average yard per return on punts and kickoffs, but some of that's the return guy making 4 or 5 guys miss tackles. You know what I mean? So it's like, Hightower special teams in San Francisco and then that 1 year in Chicago as the assistant, they were average to below average in return yards in a lot of those years. But again, those return men, not necessarily like whereas we saw Jakeem Grant this season be a difference maker there. And how much of that was the blocking versus Jakeem Grant? We saw Grant's speed certainly running away from the rest of the unit and making some guys miss. And same with like Khalil Herbert. And we'll get into all of those guys who could be back and who might not be next on Locked On Bears. Today's episode brought to you by the makers of the world's best tasting protein bars, Built Bars. And I do not exaggerate when I say this is the best tasting protein bar I've ever had in my entire life. And I've tried quite a variety of protein bars. I wouldn't call myself a connoisseur, but I like to go to the gym. I like to work out. I take a protein shake afterwards. I like to eat protein regularly during the day for muscle growth and maintaining. And so I've tried a lot of different protein bar products, and nothing tastes as good as a Built Bar and then also has the same macronutrients as a Built Bar. Because every Built Bar is covered in 100% real chocolate, head to toe, full surface area layer of chocolate. Plus, on the inside, they're soft and they're easy to chew, right? They taste like candy bars. But every single Built Bar is also low calories, right around 130, low sugar, usually 3 or 4 or 5 grams, but high fiber and high protein. We're talking 16, 17, 18 grams of protein in every Built Bar. They come in a bunch of delicious flavors. And I promise, if you try them, you will find a flavor you like. Head on over to Built.com, enter in our promo code LOCKED15, and you're going to get 15% off your next order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. We'll see exactly how Hightower and the Bears are going to build this Bears special teams in 2022, because right now, Jakeem Grant is a free agent to be, punter Pat O'Donnell is a free agent to be, and long snapper, Patrick Scales is a free agent to be. Then you have, some questions about Tariq Cohen's health and what role he could take in 2022. And all of a sudden, there's some room for some flexibility there. I guess we could start that like Cairo Santos is under contract. There shouldn't be any major concern or reason to, bring in real kicker competition. You could bring in a camp leg, just to have another name in there, someone getting some experience in case, heaven forbid, Santos gets hurt at some point or something like that. But other than that, we've seen now 2 full seasons of pretty darn high level kicking from Cairo Santos. There was a couple of blips this past season after he missed after he attempted that 65-yarder and missed. He kind of missed a couple after there, but settled back in by the end of the season. So he should be plug and play, good enough consistency, kicker carousel conversation over. But the Bears just this week, was it yesterday or the day before, signed a new punter and a new long snapper that aren't Pat O'Donnell or Patrick Scales. The punter was Ryan Winslow, who actually started with the Bears. He started his career, I should say, with the Bears in 2018 as an undrafted free agent, and then was cut that preseason. Of course, couldn't beat out Pat O'Donnell at that time. Went to the Alliance of American Football, the AAF, with the San Diego Fleet and Memphis Express. Got some punts in there, but spent most of his career on the practice squad. This past season, I think he got in for 2 games with the Panthers and was their punter for a couple of games. But really this like true bounce around journeyman punter. This past January, last month, he spent 6 days on the 49ers practice squad before Hightower had been hired to the Bears. So I think pretty clearly there, like Hightower wanted him on the practice squad in San Francisco. Hightower comes to Chicago, says, Winslow, come on a futures deal to come stick around with us in Chicago. Not going to be a Pat O'Donnell replacement, right? You're not going into the season with Winslow as your plan. He is a camp leg they're getting in early because Hightower seems to like him for some specific reason. He's going to be that camp leg. Really, I think the Pat O'Donnell conversation really just comes down to, okay, what what was Pat O'Donnell's relationship like with Richard Hightower in 2016 when they worked here together, right? I'm not to say that there's any chance they like didn't get along well, but it's just like they did work together. So if they got along really well and they like each other and Hightower likes O'Donnell, then there's no reason why he won't be back. But if Hightower was kind of lukewarm on O'Donnell here and wants to go in a different direction, then that's probably going to be a change in punter at that point. But I don't think O'Donnell is necessarily a great punter. I think the Bears can do better at punter, but you can also do worse at punter. And I think there's something to be said about maintaining some of that consistency in who your punter and kicker, and your punter is also your holder, I should say, on the field goal operation team, with a new special teams coordinator coming in and a new assistant special teams coach. And that idea of getting used to Soldier Field in Chicago and this whole special teams unit, that maybe a couple years in or whatever, you could consider making a change once things are stabilized or whatever. And not that it would take that long, but I don't see any major reason against bringing O'Donnell back, but I would be interested in seeing what kind of potential upgrades could be out there as well. We're not going to spend much time on the long snapper Bo Brinkley, who they just brought in, but he spent 8 years as the Titans' full-time long snapper. Halfway through 2020, he got COVID, then got injured. They ended up moving on from him. He spent the last season on the practice squad. I think he was with the Cardinals for a couple of games, but he's more like a legitimate replacement for Patrick Scales, right? I mean, experienced, consistent long snapper for the Titans for a long time. They could still bring back Scales and have the two of them compete, but just an interesting signing that it's not just like some young guy that they brought in to be a backup long snapper for training camp. Like, this is a legitimate veteran who could very well be their answer and a change there for this season. We'll kind of keep an eye on what that might look like. But the real question is going to be in the return game, because Jakeem Grant had a great year. Looked like, kind of out of nowhere. We knew he was fast, but just had never had that much success as a returner in Miami. He had muffed some kicks there and had problems holding on to them. So, like, what do you pay for that then as a free agent? I wouldn't give him, Cordero Patterson money, because I want to upgrade wide receiver much more dramatically. So if I'm bringing back Grant, it's almost exclusively to be a special teams player only and not a part of the wide receiver rotation all that much. So I'm not going to pay $5 million or whatever for Grant. If he can get that somewhere else, good for him. If he would come back cheap and be my returner again, absolutely, I'm rolling with Grant. But keep in mind, you do have Khalil Herbert to be your kickoff return guy. He's had some nice returns. A little eager sometimes, but speed and ability to certainly has the skills to be able to house one if the blocking is going to be correct for him there. And if Tariq Cohen is healthy and ready to go this season, we've seen him be a Pro Bowl punt returner. So you could get by without Jakeem Grant and roll with Khalil Herbert on kickoffs and Tariq Cohen on punts. You also have Daz Newsome with some returning experience, although not a guy, again, you don't go in with him as your plan A on the return game, but a fill in there if injuries are to come in place. It's just, I don't know how much I can trust Tariq Cohen's health status, given how much time he has missed with this ACL injury. What level of Tariq Cohen are you going to get? Is he going to be confident cutting and being that playmaker that we saw before his injury? Would you rather keep him more so on offense to play running back and some wide receiver and don't make him focus on special teams all that much? Or do you reduce his offensive role? Excuse me. Do you reduce his offensive role and make him more of a special teams guy and rely more heavily then on Montgomery and Herbert on offense? There's some different ways you can go about it. And so many of those health questions we just won't have an answer to on the outside. I'm also intrigued by the idea that, like, if the Bears are going to sign at least a couple free agent wide receivers and maybe draft a wide receiver or two, that one of those guys presumably will be some sort of, hopefully, like, dynamic athlete. And that could also then offer them up as a special teams return option for you, which again seems like more likely that a Grant wouldn't come back. Between Herbert, Cohen, and the possibility of signing other players at other positions that could also return, unless Grant comes back on a cheaper deal, I would imagine all of those other factors could reduce some of the likelihood that he's brought back. We'll see. Maybe they really do value him and want him to be part of that whole special teams operation, but it is a new regime. So we'll see exactly how they choose to handle things on special teams. I don't know that we're going to devote whole podcasts to special teams throughout the rest of the offseason, but when there is news to talk about, we'll be breaking it all down for you 5 days a week right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today and every day. If you're looking for that second listen, the Locked On Podcast Network has your team every day for all of your Chicago sports. Locked On Bulls, Locked On Cubs, Locked On White Sox, and Locked On Blackhawks. Even if, college football, Locked On Illini, Locked On Big Ten, Locked On Iowa Hawkeyes. I know there's a lot of crossover that way, and so much more. So, I hope you'll keep tuning in for all of our Bears analysis. I hope you'll check out our other Locked On Podcast Network shows. And I hope that the Locked On Bears podcast in particular makes it that much easier for you to bear down.